It's going. All right. Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and I'm Josh, and I'm speaking today to Nick Susi, who wrote this really interesting Substack piece called Magic Online that I really wanted to talk about because sometimes I think the lines between technology and magic are a little bit blurred. And Nick wrote a really interesting piece that I think went into it pretty well. Yeah, Nick, maybe rather than me butchering your introduction, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and go into it?
Sure. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, my name's Nick. I professionally do a lot of research. I do a lot of strategy work for a variety of different types of clients, big and small companies, individuals. I started out in music, working with like a lot of artists. But the through line through it all is really helping folks that I work with and collaborate understand these like macro cultural shifts and how to adapt to them. And that can be applied in any number of ways. So we'll talk about that in the sense of like new technology and magic in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I guess is this like a kind of topic like I don't know, are you into like esoteric or like the occult? Was this like something that fascinated you before while working with I don't know the different people you worked with before?
Yeah, I mean, part of what I love about my work is I just like to learn, and it allows me to just like learn about a lot of random shit and go very deep very fast. And I think in this case, I was interested in magic as a kid more from like the like performance like
Mm,
magic, less so the occult. Um, because of my grandpa, he was a magician, but
cool.
it was part of what I like about my work too is like you just get to talk to like a lot of really random, fascinating people. And through the process of doing a lot of this research, it was awesome speaking to a lot of magicians and kind of probing what their thoughts about technology in the future were.
Right.
I learned a lot. It was great.
Cool, cool. Yeah, so in this piece called Magic Online, is what it was titled, you start off noting that like each wave of technology has been accompanied with some like amount of magical thinking along with it. You had some like really interesting examples. I was wondering if you want to like talk about maybe some of the I guess the ones that you find the most interesting.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Um, I guess to start to define it, like magical thinking is basically the belief that your thoughts or words or emotions, different ritualistic behaviors, like all these things have some kind of special influence or supernatural power over the world around you. And so, what I wanted to explore was this relationship between magical thinking and like every major innovation technological cycle since the birth of electronic or electric media with the telegram in like the 1800s to the present day. So, there's a lot of different examples that I get into, but I think some interesting ones, first with the telegram. When the telegram first became publicly available, there were these two young teen sisters, the Fox sisters, and they would host these seances, and they would claim that they could communicate with ghosts and spirits through this like Morse code, like tapping on tables, on walls. And it sparked this like major growth in the Western spiritualism movement of people believing in ghosts, thinking that they could communicate with them, and a lot of this, stemming from the telegram, and subsequently lots of debates about whether these claims and abilities were real or fake. And even after the sisters admitted this wasn't real, they were long debunked. Despite that, the spiritualism movement that they were a big part of kind of kept growing, despite that knowledge. I think another example is around like the camera and photography. Um, in the early 1900s. Similarly, there were also two very young girls. They claimed that they had captured these photographs in their camera of fairies in their backyard garden, which then became known as the Cottingley fairies. And by 1900 standards, it went super viral. Um, again, it like sparked this huge growth and popularity in the Western like spiritualism movement. Lots and lots of debates again about, are these fairies and photographs real or fake? Um, Ironically, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who's the creator of Sherlock Holmes, one of the he was one of the foremost supporters of these photographs. Like he was really like investing a lot of time and money and like making sure that like everyone saw this amazing thing. Which of course it turned out these fairies ended up just being like cut out paper dolls on sticks, and that these two, really young girls fooled like the creator of the world's greatest detective. Uh, Very ironic, but
Right.
there's a great book by Jeffrey Sconce called Haunted Media that explores like a lot of these things that I talk about, that I highly recommend.
Mm. Very cool. I think there was one that maybe you mentioned of like Thomas Edison. Like he also was like trying to push a kind of like was it like electricity and ghost connection?
Yeah, it was called the Spirit Phone. He was trying to invent a version of the telephone that you could use to communicate with
Hmm.
the dead, basically.
Right.
So it's just interesting to see like there's almost no exception. Like every major technological innovation, you see the same kind of stories and patterns emerging. And in the research at essay, I only really focus on like the start of electric media and forward to the present, but I think technology has accelerated a lot of this, but this is something that's existed like even longer ago. Like one example that I love that I didn't end up including that predates electric media and modern technology is, for like hundreds and hundreds of years from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, like people believed in unicorns, and they thought that the horns of this, mythical beast had these like magical properties
Mm.
that could prevent you from being poisoned. So people would find and sell these actual horns, mostly to royalty, to either turn them into powder. They would put them in drinks, and they would think that they would be prevented from being poisoned to death. Um, or they would make the horns into these like goblets that then whatever gets poured in like couldn't be poisoned. And it wasn't until way, way later that people realized that what they mistook for unicorn horns were actually narwhal tusks that historians
Mm.
assume that like the Vikings brought over probably around like 1000 AD. But the point of all this is that there's these constant historical patterns that show us it's like a very real human experience to turn to the supernatural or conspiracy or spiritualism, the occult, whatever, in our effort to make sense of new and unfamiliar things, especially technology and new
Mm.
media, and how they might change or affect us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, yeah, essentially, I found that like through my experience of being in crypto, like there is like a not insignificant amount of what I can only kind of describe as like techno hippies or like people who are like at the same time very into computers and digital tech and also into some form of like uh, spiritualism and magical thinking that I found like interesting. Um, but yeah, I mean, and then now with like the proliferation of AI, this has become, I think, like I don't know, it's just been like turbo boosted or something like that. With I don't know if you just like go into a lot of the like more intense kind of like EAC type of stuff. I mean, they pull a lot from like Nick Land, of course, and like there's this like element of the occult inside of this, and so I mean, to me, it's like yeah, it tracks when you know the history is like oh, like this is not the first time at all. I mean, probably the the discovery of fire was probably this huge religious like spiritual event for early humans or whatever else. Um, but yeah, you also talk about. I mean, I think you're kind of alluding to it now, but or before, but like magical thinking as being a way for people to have a kind of sense of control. Um, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I wonder if you maybe you can explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, yeah. So a lot of magical thinking is this coping mechanism for stressful or uncertain situations. It can really help people feel more in control when they have very little control, to calm anxiety, to build confidence, whatever. So, I mean, there's so many examples of this. So in sports, we frequently see people in the ritual of like wearing certain items of clothing so your team doesn't lose. Or, if you're gambling, you're betting on your lucky number so you don't lose. Like those are small, kind of trivial, harmless examples. When you start getting into like psychology and mental health, with something like OCD, someone might try to regain a sense of control over their like looping, anxious, intrusive thoughts through a certain behavior. Like, I'm going to touch this doorknob 5 times before leaving the house so that when I leave, I know it's not going to catch on fire, whatever, right? Um, and even when you start getting to like science and medicine, you see this with placebo effects, both positive and negative. Like someone can take something that's not actually real medicine, but the belief and perception that it is real is enough to like actually have some kind of healing effects or whatever over the thing. Um, and so, like the examples we were talking about before, you can turn to the telegram or the spirit phone
Mm.
uh, to try to communicate with a lost loved one because you're grieving, or you can turn to these magical unicorn horns as a king or queen who fears for their life through assassination. All of these things defy logic and rational thinking. We're like turning to these irrational measures to regain this sense of control over like really real kind of underlying feelings, fear, whatever. um, but to bring it back to today, like when you look at now, especially, the world is on fire. Like climate, geopolitical conflicts rising. We're still in like the aftermath of COVID, financial struggles everywhere, and I think the more extreme the stress and uncertainty, it's likely that there's a more extreme like coping mechanism. And I think on top of all of that, then you add technology into the equation. There's this like constant new, we're like always in a new technological innovation cycle now. They're getting faster and faster, more frequent. And the ways that they're fundamentally changing society and us as individuals is not insignificant. And so all those things combined, like you have this perfect recipe for magical thinking. And I think this is where I'm like a little speculative, but I think as magical thinking becomes more frequent and normative amongst a group of people or a society, like when you look at social proof, like we are social creatures, like we mimic and imitate and mirror each other. Like it could grow into this like mass sociogenic illness that's very culturally normative to a group or a period of time, um, that then starts to feel like this like epidemic of collective delusion. And I think when I look at what's happening in the world today, I'm like, that maybe explains a lot of how we got here.
Mm. Yeah, I don't. Did you like one of the things that kind of comes to mind for me is like are the like the singularity type of stuff. Like to me, that feels like
Mm.
very much a kind of um, almost like a coping mechanism that like technology is going to keep going no matter what. Like the techno capital machine is going to keep innovating and innovating and making new stuff and new stuff, that we just should like lay back and like just let it happen and like embrace it for the god that it is. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you were saying before, like the on both extreme ends of the spectrum, like AI doomerism or like complete embrace of this singularity. Um, I, I don't know for sure, but I would imagine that it's very connected to these historical patterns.
Yeah.
It's just like our current flavor of how it's manifesting in the world. Or like, you're talking about Web3 before, like there's these borderline religious, almost cult-like communities forming around Web3 as this almost like magical, spiritual thing that's going to
Right.
change the world. Like I think all these things are connected. And to me, like I think when you don't see the historical patterns, it's really easy to be like, oh my God, like what's happening in the world? Like,
Mm.
why do people believe this? Whatever. But I think I kind of already felt this, but as I went like super deep into this, it's showing me that it's almost normal, even though it's not normal in a way. Like it makes me feel a lot more empathy for like, oh, this is like actually quite expected and unoriginal almost. Um, it's just like we're kind of coloring within the lines of like the framework
Uh,
of what is to be expected.
mm,
Um, and to be clear, I I say that as someone who works in technology and uses all of these emergent tools every day, and I'm very like excited and curious about them.
mm,
I'm not like a anti technology
sure.
person. I just think it's really interesting, um, in understanding these like historical and humanistic patterns. How it just better helps us understand, what's happening.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I mean, even like, I don't know if people remember like Y2K and like these types of events where, this expectation of some like big event was supposed
Yeah,
to happen, and then it was, there's something about like also, I mean, kind of like remember like the first few times I was using like these AI kind of like image generation tools, I was like, wow, this is crazy. This is like fucking, I haven't, been this excited about something in a while. And then it loses, but like I kind of noticed that it loses its magicalness, at least for me. It becomes less magical after you see it a few times. It's almost like this yeah, something about like this novelty, and then like seeing something emergent, I think is like, it's exciting and scary at the same time. That like, like this completely changes, XYZ or whatever. And to, yeah, you have to cope with like, because you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So you have to make this kind of like funky, I don't know, malleable kind of framework, I think, that is like conducive with kind of magical thinking, I guess, to make sense of it. And that's not like to be like, I don't know, like I'm also like sympathetic with people, in that, because it's like, yeah, there's a lot of shit going down and it's hard to make sense of it all. So we have to like come up with these stories or narratives that are malleable enough to like whatever could happen in the future. I see it.
right. Totally. Totally. Yeah. I mean, that's part of why I was trying to use magic as this encompassing metaphor of how to talk about and think about this, because to what you were saying before, it's like to me, if you see the same magic trick over and over again, granted, some people might be totally mystified by it every time, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with
Hmm.
that. Um, but I think some people start to see like, oh, okay, like I see where they hid the card
Mm,
on the second time, and now every
right.
time after that, you have a totally different way of seeing and thinking about it and like navigating that. And I just think that's very true about this context as well. Like the first time you use Midjourney or Chat GPT or so, it's like, oh my God, this is gonna change everything. And it might. But maybe not in the like extreme
Hmm.
ways, and in like mystical ways that, uh, there's like some of these narratives that form around.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know. And then I think there's so much to say about like, at least in the Bitcoin world, especially, there's a lot of there's a very close link with like religious thinking and like Bitcoin maximalism, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, but so like this question, I think that you bring up, is it real or is it fake? I think is like it's great at encapsulating kind of like also the moment now with like the proliferation of AI, which of course seems to be growing, and it's like, oh my God, everything's going to be AI. I'm not going to be able to know what is reality and what is not. This is classic Baudrillard. We're all in a simulation, simulacra, whatever else, and yeah, I think like this is not like a new phenomenon, of course. They said, and we can see like how media has already kind of blurred anyways what is real. Like we didn't need AI to blur reality. That's like already kind of been happening for a few decades now. And you kind of, and then you talk about like, I think, because I studied neuroscience, so I found it like, I was like, oh yeah, he was right. Like our brains constantly also trick ourselves as like part of survival. Like that's like what humans do in order to like do whatever. But yeah, I guess, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about this more on this like uh yeah, on this, is it real, is it fake, and like how our brains are tricking us anyways.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I'll start with the media part, and then we get into fun neuroscience. So, part of what I talk about in the essay is a few examples. So, one, if you look at the Roman Empire, they're bred in circuses. Basically, the ruling class, created these entertaining spectacles in the Colosseum. So, think like Russell Crowe and the Gladiator, like, are you not entertained? Like that whole
Yeah.
vibe. Um, but these were designed to generate this like public approval by feeding all these people superficial comforts, the bread, circuses, while meanwhile diverting attention away from the realities like what's actually happening, which is like the ruling class keeps building more and more power, control. It's all misdirection, which again is why I keep leaning back on this like magic analogy. The perceived reality presented before you is actually a distraction from like what's actually happening behind the scenes,
Mm.
right? um, and other examples with Edward Bernays, who's Freud's nephew, and in the 20th century, basically after the First World War, Bernays started to apply the principles of war propaganda, like how do you shape public perception and drive action to like make people willing to go die in a war, to business. And he became the father of public relations, as is known today, and really laid the foundation for that. And so one of his earlier experiments is the torches of freedom. He basically used the spectacle of like women smoking while marching in parades, like big Easter Day parade, whatever, which by 1920s standards was extremely controversial. Like it was only really men smoking. If women did it, they were kind of looked at as like dirty or like it should be outcast or whatever. But in creating these media spectacles, started to transform cigarettes into the symbol of like women pushing back for their freedom, for
Mm-hmm.
equality, and cigarettes became the symbol for it. So the designed or constructed perceived reality of cigarettes as this symbol through media kind of overtook the actual reality of what cigarettes are. I
Mm.
think Bernays even went so far as to like pay for scientists or whatever to do experiments that basically saying like these are not bad for your health,
Yeah.
to stick with that perception. So in doing so, over the decade of that, cigarette sales unsurprisingly spiked. They like went way up. They increased exponentially amongst women. But over the next 100 years to now, Bernays' work really planted those early seeds for what modern consumerism looks like today, and why it is that we just buy tons of shit that we don't actually need. It's like we perceive that these things are important, that we do, when the actual reality is like that we might not.
Yeah, this is I think it was a Society of the Self. I think Adam Curtis's documentary he goes into this a bit. But yeah,
Yeah, Century of the Self is a great Adam Curtis
yeah,
documentary. Yeah.
no. So like for me, like you know, uh, I wrote some notes about this because I remember this study in like one of my neuroscience classes about this bird. So like in this study they showed that like it's called the herring gull. The chicks of the herring gull would react to the red beaks of their mothers, and that's what they would peck at for food. There's kind of like when they were born they're already ingrained with like peck at the red thing, and then scientists created a wooden board in which they put like a really intense red dot on the board, and they found that the chicks were even more reactive to that board than they were like the mother's beak for pecking at it for food. So it's like this, like for me, I remember thinking like, this is like, this is kind of what like hyper real is, like it's like more intense than kind of like maybe the, I don't know, biological or native kind of reaction that your body evolved for. And now it's like becoming much more intense. And I think that is what a lot of really good marketing is, it's just like kind of like you have maybe this like natural desire for XYZ, but you just like you find the loophole or whatever to like make people react to it like 10 times more, so that they really need to whatever buy cigarettes so that they can appear in such a way. In psych, they call it
Yeah,
the peak shift effect. Didn't remember that, but yeah.
yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, it's, our brains are fascinating. Like, I think the more that we understand about how our brains are naturally wired, we start to understand what our own natural and very human vulnerabilities are, that we can better watch out for, if only we had better awareness, right? Um, I mean, you studied neuroscience, probably far more than I do,
It's a
but
long time ago now.
our brains, yeah, our brains are like these prediction
Yeah,
machines, and we're not always good at predicting
yeah,
things.
yeah.
And we're constantly trying to like predict and fill in the gaps of how we make meaning, from what we see before us. And our brains are like constructing these perceived realities through this constant prediction and like controlled hallucination cycles,
Hmm.
um, like autocomplete for our brains. um, I think a lot about, I had heard a while ago, like if you drink a glass of water, you immediately feel hydrated and refreshed, even though our actual body hasn't like processed that water for hydration until much later.
Hmm.
And I think, you know, it's just good like metaphors or frameworks for everything else, because I think it's our lack of not knowing our own limitations, natural, totally human limitations and biases, that fuels a lot of this magical thinking. Like the uh, the Dunning Kruger effect is basically like this cognitive bias where people have very little to no competence or knowledge in a particular area, but are like very confident in overstating their thoughts or abilities. And like, I don't know about you, but every time I open up TikTok or Twitter or whatever, like that's basically all I see. It's
Hmm.
like people trying to predict the future or like make sense of what's happening in the world that they have little to no control over, to fill in these gaps and feel a greater sense of control, even though a lot of people are just like not right at all. And it's like rooted in no reality, but it's just like, it's that bias. It's just like, well, I have to know, I have to predict, like I have to feel that sense of control.
Right. I think it's sometimes, I think for a lot of people it's more comforting to believe in something that's not correct right now than to believe in nothing. To believe in that like
Right.
anything could happen right now. Like, if anything can happen, then what do I do right now? Like what do I prepare for? But I would rather, believe in something kind of off because at least that gives me direction. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Cause again, it like goes to very core human feelings. Like it's very scary to be stuck in this perpetual state of like not knowing, uncertainty, no sense of control. Like it's just not like a nice place to be. So there are like positive psychological benefits of like why we do this. Like it really is a coping mechanism, or like a self-preservation or something,
Hmm. Yeah. And because um, since you're talking about like creators on Instagram or TikTok or whatever, like you mentioned, everyone now is not just a creator, but they're an illusionist. I thought it was really interesting. I mean, in part, I'm wondering if like this can at least be said because we're using technology that none of us seem to be able to fully comprehend, that shares information across like vast networks that I mean, just no one knows how exactly it works, it seems. And like, the specifics. And of course, like me, unfortunately, being a content creator, I guess, like, like, am I an illusionist? Because like, I also, because there is this like pressure in content creation to like, whatever, like, I hate like you have to put like soy boy face in the YouTube thumbnail because people are gonna react, like that's gonna up your click rate. And like I go through these like YouTube recommendation, like how to be a YouTuber type of stuff, and like I don't know, I mean I fucking hate it, but I also know that like if I just do a little bit of some of those things and like I see the results, like it does, like more people tend to click and more people tend to look because of this like ridiculously titled episode. I got to think of something absolutely ridiculous to title this one because we're talking about magic and technology. But like that's how I like am able to spread like my content, which is of course not my entire goal of what I do, but it's at least part of it.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, to be fair, I'm being a little cheeky and provocative when I say that about like everyone's an illusionist.
But I think like I
I'll,
took it
I'll
as
answer.
like inadvertently an illusionist because you're using like the tools of TikTok or whatever platform, and like, you can't do the shit that you do on these platforms in the way that you would do in real life. I don't know. There's like
Right.
more unknown.
Yeah. Everything's a choice. Like, and when I say somewhat jokingly, everyone's an illusionist, it's not also implying that that's like a bad thing.
Sure.
Because I think everything's a choice. To what you just said, like, while our online lives and like real lives are getting more and more blurred, and I think the significance of our online lives continues to grow, there are certain choices made about like how we present things online that doesn't happen in the same ways in real life. Like, so even there's a great analogy that my friend Matt Klein, who's the author of Zine and the head of Foresight at Reddit, like a good analogy that he uses is like documentaries. What you see in a documentary is still fueled by decisions that like a director or an editor made.
Hmm.
They're not actually showing you uh, some kind of like objective thing, even if they're trying to be as objective as possible. There's still
Yeah.
decisions made about like where the camera's pointing, what gets cut, what gets left in. Um, I was just watching last night Gerard Carmichael's reality show, which I love and absolutely recommend. But basically, Gerard Carmichael, he's a writer, comedian, actor. Um, he's basically doing like a Truman show to himself. Like he's just having cameras follow him around everywhere, both in his life and in his stand-up performances. And part of his whole like thing is he like really tries to lean into the most uncomfortable personal situations to like expose his own vulnerabilities and almost like work through them live with an audience. It's really cool. Like I love it. It's very unique to him. But I think what's interesting about the show is like what he's showing you as an audience, there's still decisions made behind the scenes that you don't know
Yeah.
about that's shaping the narrative and like how you perceive what his real life is. And he almost acknowledges that in like a sneaky way in the first episode, where he has a friend come in and be like, I want to have no part of this because you're basically manipulating things behind the scenes, like people don't actually know. And so that's the very blurry gray line that we live in, where we look to social media as like real life,
Mm.
from our friends, from our peers, from strangers, but like we don't actually know. There's a huge gap between like what we see and what has actually been choices made of like what's shown, what's not shown, how things are edited. Um, and again, that's not a bad thing. That's just kind of like the reality of how the mechanics of that machine works. Um, and it feels like a fault to just assume that when you like pop up your phone and open up a social media app or whatever, that everything you see is real.
Hmm. Yeah, that's something that like I found kind of a to like at a certain point. I remember I realized like when you're looking at media, everything is a choice in how it's kind of worked out, and that like I don't know, this idea of kind of like purely objective news or something like that is like a little bit, it feels to me like a little bit of a farce. Like you can't really, like, what is true objectivity, and is that even something that is like plausible or feasible necessarily in a lot of different contexts and media. But yeah, like even if you want to be your authentic self, to be as authentic as possible, you have to perform authenticity in many ways. Like, there is no such thing as like not performing authenticity, it seems. So you have to, I don't know, like we're all life's a stage and we're all like performing, like especially when it comes to social
Totally.
media.
Yeah, totally. I mean, part of what inspired going down this rabbit hole and writing about all this, I think I mentioned before, my grandfather, in addition to being an accountant, was also a magician, or is also a magician. And so when I was really young, I learned a lot from him about like the secrets behind like different magic tricks and how they work, and I got pretty good at being able to like see different performances and understand, okay, I understand what's kind of happening behind the scenes and like how this is done. And
Like even
so,
if they were tricks that you didn't necessarily know the exact
right,
mechanics. Yeah.
right, totally. And so maybe like a year and a half, 2 years ago, my partner and I went to Speakeasy Magic, which is an awesome magic show at the McKittrick Hotel in New York, which I highly recommend going to. But we took some mushrooms beforehand, and we went to the magic show, and so we were not in like a totally normal state of
Uh-huh.
mind, and so each magician's coming up, they're doing their performance, and I'm like watching performance after performance, and I'm starting to feel like really, really angry. Like with every trick, I'm like looking around at the audience, like everyone's totally
He's
mystified, and
lying
I'm
to
just like,
you.
I
Don't
can't
trust
shake.
him.
Yeah, I can't shake this down. Like, don't you see? They're lying to you. And afterwards, like coming back down and like reflecting, I'm like, why did I get so angry? Um, I it it was an interesting like meditation on magic as like this perfect metaphor for our current relationship with new technology and social media and all the things, and just how much like misdirection there is at the core of everything. um, from things you were saying before about like how much new technology and the communities around them are so coded in like these ideologies beyond the product itself
Mhm.
at this point, and just how everyone really at this point is just like constructing or designing their own realities through social profiles or avatars or whatever. um, and I think we're all feeling this increasing sense of confusion about, is what we're seeing before our eyes like totally real or fake? And so that's where this like illusionist reference or analogy came from, because I think using a magic show as a metaphor, like I think part of the fun of a magic show is you are knowingly opting into what you're about to see before you is an
Mhm.
illusion, and yet they still fool you anyways.
Mhm.
And I think that's like part of the fun and what makes it so exciting. And I feel like that should be the default for how we like approach or interact with the internet or social media or new AI tools, whatever.
Mm.
But it's almost not. I think it's the reverse for most people. And I
Mm.
think the question itself of is it real or fake is the wrong question. To me, that feels like so surface
Right.
level when we need to be asking deeper questions about what is the intent of the creator or performer? Like, what is the level of awareness or consent of the audience for what they've signed up for or like logged into?
Mm.
And then what is the ultimate like impact that that has on the individual or the society or whatever? And I think that's what really separates, an illusionist or a magician or whatever who's applying misdirection to just purely entertain an audience. Because, like, to me, I was having the unfair reaction in my mushroom induced state at the magic show, being like, why are they lying? Like, it's all in good fun. Everyone has opted in, right? The intent is to entertain, there's consent of the audience. The impact is just like pure inspiration and excitement and whatever, versus, an illusionist who applies misdirection to like trick someone in a vulnerable state into like bending their belief system or opening their wallet or whatever. And like there's a lot of examples that I give in the essay of like patterns of this through both new technology but also just like within the magic community, this kind of constant struggle and fight of like, how do we preserve the art for good rather
Mm.
than it being used for um, more nefarious purposes?
Mm. Interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's the same skills that make you good at being a magician are the same skills that make you good at being a huckster or whatever else.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Totally.
That's why we should ban all magicians. No, I'm kidding.
Exactly.
But so one of the things I also want to talk about, because you mentioned social media being the problem, but also the solution. I'm like, in some ways, I'm sympathetic to that, but also a little bit skeptical in that what I've noticed is that it seems really easy, to send messages across wide networks that are really, really cheap. And it seems to me that this like ability or like affordance that now this has been able to do is that like people with a lot of money are able to basically spam, the network. Like they have way more money and are able to therefore put forward their narratives. Because I'm just thinking of like, there was a time, when people were a little bit more starry-eyed about tech and like being able to send messages across Facebook or Twitter or whatever else, like during I'm forgetting the thing in Egypt. But what ended up happening is that a lot of times, like the rich people still won out. They were able to put their message out just so much more because of the ability to do it cheaply. Whereas kind of like I feel like for a lot of people, it's like, oh, if it's cheaper, then it's better for the common person. But sometimes, so like I'm still like back and forth, and of course I'm like, I use social media all the time because I want to share my message or my content or whatever else. But I also feel like there's probably a lot of limited returns in doing that. But also, sometimes you see that someone does break through and becomes viral for like a progressive message. But anyways, I don't know if you had any like thoughts on that on that level.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a it's a big debate and discourse, right? Like who should control and have access to the creation and distribution of media? Everybody or a select few? Like, looking at some of the examples from before, whether it's in like Roman Empire times or the stuff with Edward Bernays, like there were very few people who had the control and access to creating and distributing media, and how that was then applied to shape general public, right? And so I think there's pros and cons to both, right? Like I don't think there's a perfect answer, but I think the hope is that it's net positive, that if people can then like create and shape their own narratives, that's hopefully net positive as an individual, or really more so as like communities or marginalized communities or whoever. Like how can they do that? Because I think even pre social media, like again, the patterns are very similar, the same. How people would use like print media or zines or something as a form of like rejecting the mainstream print media or whatever, as owning their own narratives,
Mm-hmm.
and how the connection between those print media formats and the growth of different subcultures or communities were able to kind of like preserve what it is that they're trying to create, and their values, and how they grow and proliferate. So I think now social media is just like another evolution of those advances, but it's not perfect by any means. There's obviously a lot of negative things, but you know it wasn't long ago that even being able to create and distribute your own podcast was just like not a possibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So yeah.
sure. I mean, like it is like when I started looking into how to do a podcast, I was like, oh, that's it. I can do that. I think, I just like assumed
So
like before that, I was just like, these guys must have like something crazy, like a bunch of money to like start a podcast. And I'm just like, oh, it's not that expensive, I guess. Um, but yeah, I guess I think part of the maybe the counter to like this argument, I think, could be that I mean, the issue is that like tech and social media is largely owned by a lot of just like a few very wealthy people, and therefore like they are able to control the narrative at the same time, and therefore they develop the technology for those needs rather than the needs for like organized communities. We don't have like social media built for communities, if that make like real communities that like
yeah.
yeah, that like sustain themselves without needing to be a giant corporation or something like that. And if that were to be found, that were to be created, and that would be a step in the right direction. I think there's also like the double issue of like sometimes I notice there are people who do really good work as far as like building great technology for democratizing or like decentralizing this and that, but because people don't have the social relationships, or like that's not like the default way that they relate to people, they don't know how to use it, or like their market is very small, because even though it's like we should all be like this, we should all be more democratic, more decentralized, whatever else, but uh, only like a select few group of people actually like make the effort to do that in their lives. The default is always kind of like individualized, atomized, uh, you know, people in the market competing with each other to be think boys on Twitter or whatever.
Like me. uh,
Me too.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't know. Like that's the nature of
Got to
power,
come up with
right? And
something magical to
how,
explain this, or else I don't know what to do.
yeah, I mean, that's the nature of how power moves and shifts and its relationship with uh, culture or cultures, of how things are, technology or otherwise, how things are co-opted by just
Hmm.
the dominant cultural force or power
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, I think these patterns are pretty consistent, but I think to your point, I think that's part of why we're seeing this narrative emerge around how like big social media feels like it's collapsing. It doesn't work anymore. People are rejecting it. Whether it's like go outside, touch grass, or um, a lot of what Yancey has been talking a lot about, the dark forest theory, where it's
Yeah.
like the decided rejection of like big social platforms and like network building, and going decidedly like very small and niche and private and closed, where you can preserve the integrity of said community, and how you're able to create and distribute and proliferate messages within a safer closed environment.
Right.
um, but again, pros and cons to that too. It's like there's massive pros for all the reasons we're saying, but the cons are like, are we creating new forms of echo chambers
Mm.
where groups that aren't as knowledgeable or educated or whatever on a certain thing are now stuck
Hmm.
in that place and not able to grow beyond that? So that feels like the next era that we're kind of like barreling towards, is how do you then do the reverse? Like, how do you break those echo chambers
Mm.
that people are creating for themselves and the social groups around them? But we'll see.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So you also talked a bit about this phenomena of the rise of pseudo skeptics. I guess that would be people like, I don't know, like Joe Rogan, or like I don't know who else you wanna mention. But do you want to explain this a little bit? Because yeah, I mean, it just, if I like go on YouTube or whatever like fucking platform, like I constantly get pushed, these types of people. I feel, and it just seems kind of bizarre that it's so like normalized, this type of thinking, and where these people go. And like, I'm not saying that like if they're wrong about a thing that makes them like terrible people, and I don't even think like they know that, or think that they're doing anything like necessarily nefarious, but just like the way they are is just like great for social media, for staying on like platforms and such. But you said this, you pulled this quote from Naomi Klein that I think was really, really key in how, yeah, I feel this way as well. That like much of the allure of like these kind of people is that they get the facts wrong, but often they get the feelings right, which I think explains a lot of like the rise of, in my view, the rise of the right, the rise of fascism is like they're, for me, their facts are very wrong, but they're really good at capturing the feeling for a lot of people. And that's something I've really struggled with. Like, how do we like rightfully portray like the feeling that everyone has, because that's ultimately what people respond to. It's like it's not the facts, unfortunately. It is like really the feeling.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's 100%. It kind of goes back to all the examples we've been talking about, and just magical thinking at its core. Like, this is an irrational behavior, not a rational one. And it's it's not even specific to politics. It's like everything, as us as human beings, and how our brains are wired, and why we are pulled towards certain things, and why we make the decisions or behave the way that we do. And it's also marketing 101. Like,
Mm.
if you look at the biggest brands, like a lot of why they have grown to the cultural status that they've grown to has only really to do with irrational reasons versus rational ones. It's really not about the product, it's not about the feature benefits, whatever. It's really about these like narratives and almost mythologies that we build around these things. Completely irrational, but it's like that's what we as human beings are like pulled to, like stories and narratives and the feelings. So with pseudo skeptics or pseudo skepticism, you know, it's really the positioning of kind of like you need to question everything, like you need to be skeptical of everything, but at its core, it's still actually not teaching you how to question things.
Mm.
It's really telling you what to believe. So it's like
Right.
some kind of ideology coded as like an open question,
Right.
right? And I think the juxtaposed differences is like more true like scientific skepticism is, you know, you're trying to validate things through some kind of objective empirical evidence. You're trying to remain open-minded and just like receive the facts. um, you know, you would consider new evidence as it's presented. There's some kind of like self-awareness of your own bias or whatever against a hypothesis or whatever. And there's like this constant search and investigation and curiosity to just like challenge yourself to keep learning more, right? And I think with pseudo skepticism, like a lot of these things are framed in a similar way, but it's still pushing you towards an answer. Like it's
Mm.
like you have to doubt the validity of everything, like question everything, be very cynical, like you must believe this despite other people like challenging your way of questioning. um, it's just very like fixed and like predetermined beliefs or biases, and when presented with like a new question, it's just like constant denial, like
Mm.
no. So I think, you know, you mentioned some others before, but when you look at like Tucker Carlson, it's like so much of how he talks about things is like you need to question reality, the truth, the media, right? Or like Andrew Tate, it's like you can't trust the matrix, question
Mm.
everything. Like the framing of these narratives resonates so well right now because it really taps into, I think, what we've been talking about this whole time, which is I think everyone's really feeling like, is it real or fake? Like you can't trust anything. And I think
Mm.
these narratives are like very sticky and contagious and attractive because it really meets the moment of what people are feeling. Um, but I think the huge caveat is like at its core, it's still like you can't trust anything or anyone except for me.
Right.
You know, I think that's like that's the footnote that like where all this kind of falls apart.
Right. 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 I'm here to do the skepticism and thinking for you. Question it, and I'll
Right.
answer.
Yeah.
um.
Right.
Yeah. I guess. I mean.
And even for me, like in doing a lot of this research and like writing this, I had to keep stepping back and check myself of like I'm like saying like question like I'm doing the thing, like I'm saying question
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
but trying to be really careful about what we were saying before. Like everything's a choice. Like I made choices about what I'm editing in and out, right? And trying to have it's nothing's perfect, like but trying to have that self-awareness and like checking myself going through this process of what is the best way of like presenting this that helps people learn the questions to ask rather than like just believe what I'm telling you. Almost like trying to like present my own ideas in ways of like don't trust this almost.
Mm.
Um, it's like it's a weird juggling act.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Um. So I mean, for you, I guess, is this like do we fight this phenomenon? Like should we fight it, or should we? I think sometimes it's like, do we just like then use the same tactics but for good, like magic, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, how they're meeting this really hard moment is a number of things, but it's like one is magical thinking, like
Mm-hmm.
that is the way of dealing with this, which is not necessarily the right or best answer. I think another one is like this growing nihilism
Mm.
of just like we know that this is true, but we also embrace that we can't control it. So fuck it all, like let's just go nuts and have a good
Mm-hmm.
time. That's an option. um, I don't know that there's one. First of all, I don't know that I have all the answers. Second of all, I don't know that there's one like silver bullet answer either. I think a lot of it starts with just general awareness and education, kind of like what we were talking about before. Even in not seeing these historical and like human patterns, it's really easy to just see what's right in front of us and be like, this feels so crazy.
Yeah.
Like, why is this happening? But I think when you zoom out, it becomes more clear that even though it doesn't change what's happening, it helps to like feel almost a little bit more control of, at least I understand why this happened. It's actually not new. It's not that unique. And I think it also hopefully starts to build empathy with other people,
Mm.
where everyone who's saying wild shit is maybe not just like a stupid idiot on the internet, and actually is like trying to deal with how you make sense of and regain control over things that we're all dealing and struggling
Yeah.
with. Because I think the default or the status quo is like everyone's a fucking moron, so you should dunk on them. Like that's kind of
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
where we're
Yeah.
at. I don't think that fixes anything,
Everyone's
unfortunately.
an idiot but
And
me. That
yeah, well, that
is.
goes back to the Dunning Kruger effect. But I think like it's like how do we go upstream in education, which is super hard because I think education is being totally like pulled apart right now.
Mm.
But if you look at places that are not the U.S., like in Finland, for example, they're doing an awesome job of how they're teaching like grade school kids how to fact check and like deal with misinformation. And so
Mm.
they're like training people super young, kind of like what I was saying. It's like, how do you ask the right questions and like teach for curiosity rather than like telling you the answers, which I think we're quite bad at here. And you see that in, Finland, I don't know what the index or like point of measurement is, but like their ability to sift through misinformation is like quite high comparatively to other countries.
Mm.
And a lot of that has to do with the education system and starting super young. Um, I think also, to the point about skepticism and this like magic analogy, there's the history of like magic is super fascinating, of what we were talking about before. Like it's all about how you apply the skills, not the skills themselves and for what intent. And all like so many of the most famous magicians, from Houdini to like James Randi or whatever, they not only like performed for entertainment, but they were also really fundamental to like forming and growing these movements of scientific skepticism and being extremely proactive about, through writing and teaching and even like speaking at Congress, um, to debunk like a lot of the things that were happening with conspiracy theories, some of these spiritualism movements. And when I look at that to how our like magicians or illusionists of today, content creators, people who create new technology products and AI, whatever, as like the proxy, the behaviors are very different. It's like, how do we obscure and misdirect as much as possible to gain attention,
Mm-hmm.
grow a business, protect the bottom line, whatever, right? Like the behaviors are very different. And I think in knowing that, it's like, what is our responsibility as, our modern illusionists or whatever, and how we use media, technology, whatever. It's not just like projecting it into these other systems that could be better, but also our individual choices. Kind of like, as I was saying, even like writing this was like, am I taking my own medicine and putting this out into the world? Um, but I think having that self awareness and line of questioning is important.
Yeah, I think there could maybe go a long way in like I'm just teaching people, like how to do a sleight of hand type of tricks almost like um I don't know. I kind of sometimes think like some of the right ways to like teach people is to like put yourself in the shoes of someone who tries to trick people, who like wants to, you know, divert people's attention like in some way, like putting yourself in those shoes. I think, well beforehand, like by simulating such a thing in like a safe environment, when you get exposed to it, it becomes very, very obvious because you already know the tricks of the trade. Um, so yeah, I think to me that's kind of what I'm getting out of like education is almost like uh, learn the tricks of the trade in many ways.
Yeah, totally. I mean,
You may be angry when you go to magic shows, but you know.
yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like there should be standard texts, like Marshall McLuhan understanding media. Like there should be like a baseline understanding that everyone has because we're all using these things. Like they're all in our pockets at this point.
Yeah,
But we've not been armed with the tools and knowledge to fully understand.
yeah. Um, yeah, thank you so much for coming up on the hour. I really appreciated the talk. The piece is called Magic Online! Exclamation points. On Nick's Substack. I'll put links there in the show notes. Yeah, is there maybe you can leave people with a last word on where they can follow you and keep up with your work?
Sure, yeah. At Nick Susi on all social platforms, and nicksusi.substack is where this essay and others are too. But thanks so much for having me on. This was
Yeah,
awesome.
of course. No, I really appreciate it.